Hello. So this isn't something that I usually do, but I felt like it was important both for me and I imagine for other people to sort of talk about what has happened to me over the duration of the year. So I was sexually assaulted in January, and I'm only sort of speaking about this properly now because I couldn't receive like any justice through any sort of prosecution or anything like that. And I think that there's because I couldn't get any sort of justice, I think I'd like to sort of talk about it and sort of continue the dialogue that like maybe the Me Too movement started, but the movement's over, but the problems are nowhere near addressed. And I don't want to talk about like exactly what happened to me. I don't think that's something that needs to be shared really. But in a criminal sense, what happened was that I was sexually assaulted by touch. So that doesn't constitute rape because it wasn't penetrative, but it doesn't constitute like harassment because it was like a tactile assault. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of share what my experience was and how it's seen legally, and what that sort of meant for me in terms of going through that, because I was very, very lucky to have a lot of people supporting me going through this, but for the person that sat there with something on their back that they've been carrying, I hope that I can provide something that makes you feel like you're not alone. And the last thing that I think is that women or other people who've experienced sexual assault or sexual violence in general, the last thing I want is that you feel afraid to come forward, because it is one of the scariest things I've had to do, and I don't think we should be afraid anymore. Yeah. So as I said, the incident happened in January, and afterwards I gave I got in contact with numerous friends and family, and I sort of roughly explained what had happened, and I think a lot of it was me trying to process what had actually happened to me. And it was a sort of thing where I was talking to people to gather support and to try and understand this thing that is so entirely incomprehensible. And then it sort of was a decision of do I report this crime to the police or do I not? And I deciding whether or not to go to the police is a really, really difficult decision. And I think, like, for me, what was important and what made me decide that I wanted to go and tell the police was that I didn't want any other, specifically for this person, I didn't want any women to be in the crossfire of his predatory behaviour, and I wanted to make sure that even if nothing happened with my case, it would be on the books for the next. And also just for the sake of, I did not want to see this person walk away without any accountability at all, because I think it was something that I needed to do both for myself and for other people around me, I think. So I did decide to go to the police about it. So 2 of my friends took me to the police station, and I said that it's the first time I'd ever been to a police station. I sort of went to them and I said, I have a crime to report. And I didn't really know what to say to them, so I just blurted that I was assaulted in January and I needed to talk to somebody. And I think I'd slightly scared the guy on the desk. And I asked for female officers, which they gave me, which was great. So I don't think at that stage I was super confident talking about really personal sort of violations with men, especially because the guy who assaulted me was a man. And I feel like as women, the community of women, they're more likely to sort of hear me and believe me, which is one of the biggest sort of insecurities and fears I'd had. So I went in the evening to Stoke Newington Police Station, and I was there for maybe about 3 or 4 hours, and basically what it was that they asked me to do was to provide an initial report of what had happened. So I had to go through and say, firstly, just to the 2 female constables who had been offered to me to take my statement, I had to speak to them and tell them what had happened in as much detail as I possibly could. And then they said, okay, cool, we've taken your statement, now we need to take a written statement. So they went through again, as I said everything again, and then they wrote it all down, after which they asked me to read through their written notes and to sort of confirm what I had said was true and to sign my name against it. And then they asked me to explain everything that had happened once more, but with their like body cameras on, so that they had a camera record, and I think also, I assume it records sound, but like a record of what had happened again. So I had to sort of go through the events of my assault from top to bottom about 4 times the first time I went in, even without deciding to prosecute. And I think I was really lucky with the constables that I got, because they were incredibly human towards me about what had happened. And one of them even ran like a background check that she wasn't meant to, and basically said that this guy's got a clean record, and I imagine that's going to make it hard for you down the line, which I was later told that she wasn't allowed to do, and she got cautioned for it, but I really appreciated that. I thought it was definitely the right thing to do, because I had no idea what was sort of ahead. Then I walked home, and it was like the middle of the night by that stage. And then I was contacted by the sergeant who was assigned to my case. He's a great guy, and he said, okay, so we're going to arrange a meeting with you. He tried to arrange a meeting with me, and I didn't pick up the phone, so he came to my house, and basically him and the detective who were assigned to my case at the time, because the detective on my case changed, they sat with me in my kitchen, and basically I had to explain what had happened again to them in my house, and go through basically like trying to figure out what exactly the crime was that I was accusing this guy of, and going sort of on fairly sort of, I don't know if insulting is the right word, but it's having to be like, okay, well, centimetre-wise and biologically, where was what piece of body in accordance to yours, and based on that, what is the crime that we're actually trying to prosecute here? After that conversation, we established that it was sexual assault rather than rape, which, I mean, on a side note, I think it's a really sort of narrow-minded and old-fashioned way of looking at sexual violence, is that if it's penetrative, it's rape; if it's not, it's assault. I don't really agree with that, because I don't think that, so like both sexual assault and rape carry really heavy sentencing, but I think that one being weightier than the other doesn't reflect the impact that it has on the person who is sort of at the end of that crime, because I think whether you're assaulted, whether you're raped, it still has a massive impact on you. So I don't think the sentencing should be different. yeah, so then after we'd sort of determined what the crime was, I was asked to make a decision sort of on my own time whether I would like to prosecute or whether I would like not to. And they explained to me the sort of process I could expect from going forward with this against not going forward with this. And the detective who was on my case at the time, who, as I said, changed, he explained to me that the number of cases that are prosecuted versus the amount of allegations that come forward is enormously disproportionate, and that I could expect and I should prepare most likely for my case not to go forward. So the process with sexual violence crimes is that I go to the police, and if I say yes, I would like to prosecute after I've given my statement, because there's a choice there of whether you do or you don't, and if you say yes, I do want to prosecute, the police then start building a case for me to then present to the Crown Prosecution Service, or CPS, and if it goes to CPS, it essentially goes to court, and then from there you might see sentencing or a fine or like whatever, depending on the crime. So I decided probably about like sometime later, I can't exactly remember how long, but I decided then to prosecute. So the police then started gathering evidence to take to present essentially to Crown Prosecution. And so that involved me for that duration. I had to keep the bed sheets, and I had to keep the condom that was involved, and I couldn't move it in my room. I had to keep it where it was in my room until like I was given a date where they would come and they would seize. There was a lot of sort of vagueness about what was actually necessary for my case and what wasn't. So for example, I couldn't move the condom, but I could wash my sheets, and I like double checked everything just in case. But they eventually said like, yeah, so we need this, but we don't need that. So I didn't necessarily see a lot of the logic behind that, but I was entirely new to sort of taking something to the police, and I think, I mean, if you're in that situation, you're given people who are meant to look after you, sort of trust them. And then so they came and they seized the evidence that they had said that they needed, and they then had a conversation with me about having an internal examination, so about whether it would be worthwhile for me to go in for what was told to me about a 5-hour invasive exam of my snatch, and it was sort of decided that, well, if there was a condom involved in the situation, then nothing would show up on a genital exam. And I also at the time didn't feel enormously up for that, quite honestly. So given the fact that it wouldn't necessarily prove that he was sexually involved with me, and it would be an incredibly strange and probably very difficult experience, I decided to sort of not do that. Then from there, it sort of went on and it went into a waiting time. But I also wanted to talk about the information that was given to me when I was asked to decide whether or not to prosecute what I had reported. And they gave me a statistic that was something like 6% of all sexual violence allegations actually see any sort of sentencing or prosecution like properly after a court hearing, which, given already like my surfacey knowledge of what women experience in terms of sexual violence or assault or harassment, felt really, really disproportionate. And I later, much later, found that when they're trained, so in the Metropolitan Police, there's a specific unit called SOIT, which is SOIT, which is to do with sexual offences, and they are trained, and within their training they are told that over 90% of all allegations of rape or sexual violence are true. So then that makes you sort of think, like, okay, well, let's say if it's the high 90s that are true and 6% see any sort of consequence, what's happening to the other 90%? And this excludes everyone who doesn't come forward, which is a stunning thing to think about, quite frankly. Yeah, and they also told me that any evidence that I couldn't provide, that would be on me to not have proven it well enough. It would have been on me, because the way that the justice system works is that the burden of proof lies on the prosecution, which is myself in this case. So I would have to provide everything in order to equip the police or a court to prove the person in question guilty. So all of the work I had to do, rather than him, because he is innocent until proven guilty. And it was also explained to me during that conversation that once it is presented to the Crown Prosecution Service, there's probably about a 50% chance of it going forward and 50% chance of it being rejected, roughly speaking. If it doesn't go to Crown Prosecution, that's sort of it. And if it does, that's when it would come to court, and I would have to appear in court and deal with that, as you would expect so. Then once I decided to prosecute, they gave me the option of giving a recorded statement or not. So the purpose of a recorded statement is that they have a video that they can play to a jury, rather than having me appear in court and give my entire statement verbally in front of a courtroom myself. There is the option that I record that prior in a police station, and that is played to the jury if it were to go to CPS, for example. So I did that in Stratford. I was there for maybe like 3 hours, I think, and they asked me, so similarly to when I first gave my initial statement, they asked me to run through everything that had happened and everything that I could remember in as much detail as I possibly could. And then they sort of went in further with more detailed and more probing questions in order to get a more solid picture of what was happening. And that was, how long was this person doing X thing for, and approximately how long, or how much pressure, or how long, how many times did you say no, yeah, just giving a very, very vast amount of detail about what had happened. After which, so then it was sort of a case of waiting then for them to gather more evidence and to arrest the person who I was accusing. So he was brought into a police station and he went voluntarily, I'm told. And he was asked to provide a statement as well, and though the information that I have from his side of things is incredibly limited, is that he basically gave a reasonably consistent report of what had happened, but excluded any of the incriminating facts of that evening. And that was that. And then he was allowed to sort of go off again. Yeah. So then during that time, what I was given sort of support wise was that the Met Police who were assigned to me, so my sergeant, my detective, my sergeant who's a SOIT officer, so specifically dealing with sexual offences, he offered me a referral to Gateway, which is, I think it's the East London Rape Crisis Centre, and it is a really, really lovely service who strive to provide as much support as they can to survivors of sexual violence. And they offered me 3 kinds of support, which were sort of guidance through the legal system of everything was the first one. Then they offered to call my GP for me on my behalf to refer me for a consultation. And the third one was a referral for counselling. And I think what I think is really important to say is that I've had an awful lot of difficult experiences in the past few years, and loss and grief, difficult relationships, there's been a fair amount, and there's been nothing that I've never felt that I needed counselling more than this, ever. I think going through this and all of the aftermath is probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, and I just hope that people don't feel afraid to come forward, because we know how hard it is, and you deserve to be heard in what has happened to you. And I know how difficult it is to fear not being believed, and to fear that somebody's gonna turn around and be like, you're lying. But it's not true. You know what happened, and I know what happened to me, and that is not going to be changed by someone coming into a police station and lying and being taken more seriously than you are. So after being referred to Gateway, so I accepted all 3 different support services that they provided. And after my call with my GP, I sort of explained that I was doing very badly. By that point I'd had to move home, and I'd had to leave my job, and I was not doing well at all. But because I managed to hold myself together well enough over the phone, and I think also the combination that it was the first lockdown as well, they sort of didn't deem it urgent in any regard, and that was sort of the end of that. With regards to the legal counselling, nothing really ever came of that, to be honest. And then the counselling that they provided, which was sexual violence specific, was they put me on a 9-month waiting list. So I guess anytime soon that will happen. But what they did send me that was useful was a collection of paperwork that was about sort of common symptoms of post-trauma and what to expect after you've survived sexual violence, an assault or a rape or anything like that. And some of the symptoms really shocked me, stuff that I was experiencing was irritability, really short attention span, suicidal thoughts, distancing myself from a lot of things. But things that I didn't expect to see on that list were stuff like irritable bowel syndrome, and how many really, really physical side effects there are to going through that sort of abuse. Then, as I said, during all of this time, the police are gathering a case on my behalf to present to the Crown Prosecution Service. And I, over the summer, got a phone call from my sergeant saying that he had some difficult news, which was that my case wouldn't be going through to CPS due to insufficient evidence. And I sort of knew that it was really, really unlikely that anybody would even listen to my case in a court. But I think, like, actually receiving that phone call is something else. And the idea that the only thing that I could have in my head was that he's gonna get away with this. There's no way that he's going to even see a court. There's no way that jury can even think about deciding about what he's done. He's free. And that felt so incredibly unfair. And I think it broke my heart. So following that phone call, I was offered the option of seeing a letter from my Sergeant Superior Officer about the decision that was made. And I wanted to read it, so I requested that. And I think it's one of the more shocking letters that I had received by this stage. And it basically went through and it stated that they believed that what I had said, and I'll share a copy of this as well, but then went on to say that there was not enough evidence, and that my annoyance with him seemed to be more with the fact that he was being a sleazebag rather than an actual criminal, and included the sentence, which I think will stay with me for a very long time, which was, I accept that behaviour was completely unacceptable, however there is no offence for being ungentlemanly. And that was quite something. After which I was offered a victim's right to review, which is my right as somebody who's reporting a crime that hasn't gone to CPS to go and dispute that decision and sort of discuss why it had happened. So I requested that, and that was just sort of on a waiting list. In the meantime, I made the decision to sort of think about making what had happened to me public, because the individual in question works in the same industry as I do in film. And there is a pattern of film being a boys' club of certain behaviours, and a lot of it is being sort of aged out as the older boys sort of go. But I felt that it was my responsibility as somebody who knew what sort of behaviour this person was capable of to inform people who are meant to be safeguarding workplaces that this is his name, this is what happened. And I was very, very careful not to ever say in that email that I sent not to hire him. I explained his name, his actions, and why I was writing to these people, but I did not at any point tell people to stop hiring him, because I knew that wasn't wise, and I had sort of heard about certain people getting defamation claims against them for that sort of thing. And that's why initially what I did was I wrote a private email to a number of people explaining that I intended to publicly say what his name was, and I then received a letter after I had sent that from the guy's solicitor, who was claiming against me for defamation, so trying to sue me, and the letter was 3 pages of very much unfounded claims a lot of which were entirely false. So the legal issues against me were defamation, harassment, and harassment. So he was trying to sue me also for harassment, which, considering I hadn't messaged him since January, was just bullshit. Like, I can't. And I think there's a special kind of breed of person who would have the immense lacking dignity to think to send this sort of letter to somebody who he's treated as he had me. Yeah. Although what I was really pleased about in terms of my email and coming forward to people is that I got an awful lot of support, and so many people aligning themselves with me and believing me. And I think, as I said earlier, like, the biggest thing that I was always afraid of was to not be believed. And I was. And I think that knowing that means an awful lot more to me than perhaps even seeing him prosecuted. So the final sort of step of the process was my victim's right for review, which came around this week. And that was sort of the end of my dealings with the police and with this whole case altogether. And it was my chance to meet the superior officer who had written that letter to me and who had made the decision not to take my case to the CPS, and with my sergeant as well. So I met with them at Bethnal Green Police Station, and it was my opportunity to basically talk through everything that I didn't understand or was unhappy with. And I went in and I was so ready to just lose it completely, because what happens isn't good enough in any sense, and he didn't see any justice or any repercussions or anything. And because he had a clean record, and because he didn't have any previous offences or any history of him being held in custody or anything like that, his credibility was solid. Which brings me on to, like, why my credibility was not, which is something I still don't really understand, to be honest, even though I spoke to them at length about it. But essentially, so in comparison to common assault, which would be something like being punched or being threatened or something like that, that would be classed as common assault, where the sentence is a few weeks or a fine or a caution, depending on the circumstance. If somebody were to come forward and say, this has happened to me, that would be enough. There is no sort of appendix evidence required for that sort of case, or for that sort of crime, sorry. But as sexual violence cases go, the sentencing is anywhere from 6 and I think 25 years in prison. So they require a lot more sort of substantiating evidence, which is where the problems come in, because he's not required to provide the evidence that I was required to provide. So I had to screenshot every message that I had sent to anybody that I had told about this at all, provide the names of every single person I told, so that they could then be called about it. and that was on top of the statements that I'd given to the police already. And what they were looking for, and what the CPS require, is that there is reasonable consistency. That's the official term, reasonable consistency across every account that I've provided, which isn't the case, because I would not have given a police statement to my dad or to other friends. I wouldn't have told every single friend the same thing, because I have different relationships with each of my friends. I have different levels of sort of openness and of comfort. There are some people I don't even talk to on social media, so it would have been in person, and there isn't really any regard for that at all. So basically the fact that all of my accounts were slightly different and omitted information that was in my police report. So for example, I messaged one of my friends sort of within 24 hours of what had happened, explaining what had happened, but I missed out the fact that he touched my vagina unconsensually. That deems my report inconsistent and makes me incredible, along with every other report I'd given to friends and family. And I spoke to them and I said, like, do you not understand that that's not how friendship works, that's not how, like, humans function in any regard? And they said, yeah, we know. This whole, like, the way this is worked is that all the evidence that you're required to provide to us to present to CPS, all of it is there. It almost seems to undermine your case, because my superior officer was saying that if it were his way, he wouldn't even speak to my family or my friends, because that information is entirely irrelevant. Like, they weren't there, and they do not take, then they might take their own thing from any message that they receive, or glean whatever they would like from a written conversation, and therefore it is not an accurate account and they are not a witness. But that is the way that it is. Equally, it's just so CPS requires phone downloads from both parties, so I provided that in terms of screenshots of everything that I'd written to anybody about anything to do with this, but they just simply told me that they couldn't download his phone. And I was like, well, how is that good enough? And they're like, well, we just couldn't download his phone, so we have no evidence on him, we don't know him, we don't know anything about him or the sort of person that he is, so we just can't build character reference. So the whole case was just entirely lopsided. So this guy with a clean record came in, lied, left, and is innocent. And the fact that I didn't lie at any point and I provided all of the information that I could, that has somehow gone against me, and I really struggle to sort of digest how that is in any way fair. And they explained to me that, like, they showed me some of the statements that they'd taken over the phone from my friends and my family, and they were like this big, like 300 words maybe over the phone, which didn't cover half of what had happened, didn't cover the extent of what had happened. It was just a statement of saying, like, so what were you told, rather than asking any questions about it. So they were what I saw was very surface level, and basically that was held as what made my statement not reasonably consistent. And yeah, we spoke about that a lot longer, and about the imbalance of the evidence that I'm expected to provide versus him, and just the way that the judicial system is structured to make it incredibly difficult for things to go to court in terms of sexual violence and sexual offences. And the thing is that they knew, both of the police officers in the room knew, and they told me that they knew that I was not lying and that I was telling the truth, and that they, judging from how he behaved, they said, as personal opinion, like, character-wise, you're clearly the person who is more credible here. But they couldn't do anything about it. And yeah, we spoke further and just sort of covered every nook and cranny of everything, and they apologised, and they said, he said to me, the guy who made the decision not to take it to CPS, that I really applaud your heart and your courage in coming to us to report this, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't take this any further. And I only joined this unit recently, but yours was one of the first cases that I saw that didn't make any sense to me at all, and I'm so sorry, but I can't see one single shred of justice in here, and I don't know what to say to you. Yeah, and that basically concluded the year. I just thought it was important to say what had happened and how the system just does not work at all in terms of getting any of these people to see any sort of consequence. And I hope that my sharing this experience opens some sort of dialogue about changing the criminal justice system, specifically for sexual offences, and also is a voice that maybe somebody needs to hear if they've experienced any sort of sexual offences, that yeah, it is really, really fucking hard, but we're in it together.